Hello, everyone, to another installment of the 007 Files. I'm Bill Koenig. I'm one of your co hosts, and I'm here today with another one of my co hosts, Javi Trujillo. And we're going to discuss two topics today. Originally, we're going to do one, but there was a bit of news this week as we record this, and we felt we needed to address the news such as it was. So, Javi, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Just got home this morning from work, got my cup of coffee, watched a little Bond, caught up on some news and some F1 news, and excited to talk to you about this news that's kind of non-news.
Yeah, we'll get into that. So we'll start with the timely aspect, which was this week, the head of Amazon MGM Studios gave an interview. Technically, it was to The Observer, which is a sister publication of The Guardian, but it's on The Guardian's website, so it's kind of like at this point it all goes in the same place. Anyway, so here were some of the quotes that came up about the state of James Bond. We have a good and close relationship with Eon and Barbara and Michael. Jennifer Salke, the global chief of Amazon MGM, said, "We are not looking to disrupt the way these wonderful films are made. For us, we are taking their lead." And then she also added, "The global audience will be patient. We don't want too much time between films, but we are not concerned at this point." So, Javi, what do you make of this?
I don't think she reads a lot of internet forums. So
Yeah,
my concern is the global audience is forgetting James Bond because they're constantly bombarded with Marvel movies and other tent poles, and from a fan perspective, we all know the Bond community is not patient at this point, especially with the bad taste that No Time to Die left in quite a few people's mouths. And at the time of this recording, we just passed the 3-year U.S. anniversary of No Time to Die. So to be at 3 years down the road, and there's, as far as we know, there's nothing going on, at least that they're revealing. It doesn't feel like the Bond community is very patient at all. And while she says we don't want too much time between films, but we are not concerned at this point, it's like, well, if you factor it's been 3 years and it would take them at least 2 to make a film at minimum from this point on. 2026, 2027 seems like that would be a release date, which is quite a ways away still.
Well, and just to add some perspective to that, it was in August of 2017 that Daniel Craig finally announced publicly he was coming back, and that was on the CBS
Stephen
Late
Colbert.
Show. Yep, Stephen Colbert. And they didn't begin filming for another 2 years after that, because at that point they didn't have a director and so forth. And then they hired a director, and then they fired the director. Well, creative differences, whatever you want to call it. And then they got another director. So, yeah, it was a good 2 years before they began filming, and it was, almost 4 years after that the movie finally came out. So these things take time, and I don't think they're going to announce tomorrow that Bond 26 is going into production.
Or November.
Yeah.
At a specific award show. Doesn't seem very likely. I mean, it could all be smoke and mirrors. You or I don't really know. But Eon has, for the last 40 years been reactionary. And what I mean by that is, Moonraker was capitalizing off of Star Wars. We all know how Casino Royale was going off of the success of Batman Begins. And then with, the Marvel Studios method of having these big plot lines stretched out over years. Like we kind of saw that with the Daniel Craig era, how they pivoted to one big 5-part story. And if you look at those other franchises right now, part of it's financial because of COVID and then the actor strikes, um, there's been talk of like fatigue. Like certainly the Marvel Studios movies aren't as popular, or they don't seem to be as popular or as immediate as they used to. And even Star Wars, where they're going to have a Star Wars movie every year, and after they've had a couple of things not perform to expectations, they've kind of stepped back away from that. And even like the Star Trek franchise, where Paramount Plus was like, we're going to have a new Star Trek show every week. And that never really materialized. And now they've canceled certain shows despite their popularity. Planned things have changed. And so I wonder if this is Eon's reaction right now is like, well, everyone else is taking stock and slowing down. Maybe they're feeling they have a chance to get a breath of fresh air and kind of get a better idea of where things are headed. Honestly, I don't know where that is or what people want to see, but it feels like the pendulum always swings, and it seems like maybe it's time for not a silly Bond, but a more fun Bond. Still being grounded, maybe back towards a Brosnan style of film. I don't know. I don't know where we're going.
Well, just to add on to what you just said, the whole business of the Craig films being a continuous arc, that was done retroactively.
Right.
Because at the press conference they had in 2011, just as Skyfall was going to begin filming, Sam Mendes specifically said that this movie had nothing to do with the first two Craig films. And that's more or less how they played it with Skyfall. And then in Spectre, they like, oh, never mind, it's all the same thing. And suddenly Silva had been part of Spectre all along. And so I just wanted to add that. And you're right about franchise fatigue. I would also add into there the Mission Impossible films from Tom Cruise, because the last entry it did okay, but the costs were higher, and they didn't really expand the audience beyond the core Mission Impossible audience. Now, originally that was going to be a two-part movie.
Yeah.
And then now they've said, well, it's not two parts anymore. And they delayed the second part a year, so we won't see that until 2025. But
I don't even think when it went up on Paramount Plus, I think the actual film credits still read Dead Reckoning Part 1, but when you select the movie, it's just Dead Reckoning. Yeah, they're not really acknowledging, even though it has it to be continued at the end.
Yeah.
They're not quite selling it as Part 1 anymore.
Right.
And there were other things that went in with that too, with David's favorite director, Christopher Nolan, having Oppenheimer come out. That stole a lot of Mission Impossible thunder because of the IMAX screens and how they allotted more screens for Nolan because he used IMAX cameras and was, touting the format. And while Mission Impossible certainly had aspects of that, they're not as revered as Christopher Nolan is when it comes to those distributors. And there was supposed to be a deal in place that Mission Impossible would go back into theaters after a certain length of time in IMAX screens. But the whole Barbenheimer phenomenon happened, and Oppenheimer just kept chugging along, and it wasn't financially feasible for them to put a lower grossing movie in that wasn't keeping up the business, so to speak.
Right.
So
by that time, it was too late for Mission Impossible to get any IMAX screens back. And that's the other thing in general is like the premium ticket prices for IMAX and related formats has become an increasingly important part of the economic calculation. Anyway, but we'll see. Well, let's move on because
there was one more bit though. Salke also gives her version of reports alleging that early on she got on the wrong side of broccoli for raising the idea of a Bond TV series. She's quoted as saying it was never really raised in that way. But when you're looking at iconic intellectual property like that, you look at what the entire long term future might be. And of course, you look at every facet. So I know there have been people who wanted to see maybe like a TV show or thoughts of like spin off character TV shows, maybe doing like Amazon only, like lower budget, truer adaptations of Fleming. People have tossed out like that could be an avenue. But it seems like the only TV show we're getting is Road to a Million, which is Bond in name and music only, really.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, and I was about to say there is a trendy fan theory that the delay in Bond 26 is all Amazon's fault. And I've always been skeptical about that, and I even cooked up a joke, but I don't have enough time to tell it. But basically, Sulky has kind of she made the joke reality. It was a takeoff on "Would you believe?" and it begins with "Would you believe Amazon is the only it's the only reason there's a delay in Bond 26," and you eventually get down to, "Well, would you believe they're all singing Kumbaya?" and and Sulky is making it sound like they're all singing Kumbaya. So
Yeah.
she's made the joke a reality. So
But it still seems
anyway,
like the ball is in Eon's court on what they're doing, which, I mean, I'm fine with that. Um,
yeah, yeah.
I don't
So
want them to rush and make a bad product on the, like, I want the movie now, but I also don't want a bad movie.
right.
So we
Anyway,
continue to wait.
exactly. So we'll move on now to the second subject, the less timely subject, which is what I consider probably one of the least loved Bond cars, which is the Ford Mondeo from Casino Royale. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is I know a little bit about the background of it. And basically, the Mondeo is one of the main Ford products in Europe, at least at the time of the filming of Casino Royale. And that Ford had a number of brands in that movie. But one of the ones they wanted to promote was the redesigned Mondeo. So at the Paris Motor Show of 2006, that was when the redesigned version was unveiled. Um, and and Ford even brought in, let me make sure I got her name correctly, um, Caterino Marino, who played Solange in that film. She was part of the presentation at Paris. So then a couple months later or so, the movie comes out, and it's in the Mondeo's in it for about a minute. Bond is driving the car. Now, as it turned out, the car was a prototype. It wasn't a street legal car. The body was made, I believe, of fiberglass. One time, I had a chance to be there to see it, and I kind of tapped on the hood like this. Of course, this is
Uh-huh.
audio recording. You can't, Avi can see what I'm talking about. But just lightly tapped on, and you could just tell by the feel. This is not a very sturdy car.
Not something you would want to be in a car collision with.
And prior to this recording, I rewatched the minute that the Mondeo's in the movie, and it's like it's not in any traffic. It's like when it pulls up to the club, there's another vehicle pulling out, and anyway, it's after the movie came out, I got a call from someone I used to know at the Ian Fleming Foundation, and he was very excited when he called. He said, "What kind of Ford is that?" And I said, "It's a Mondeo. They make it in Europe. They don't sell it here. We gotta get that car." I said, "Oh," and well, yeah, that car is the first car that the Daniel Craig version of James Bond drives. Now inside, I'm thinking, but he was excited, so I wasn't going to rain on his parade. You got to help us get this car. And well, at the time, I was covering Ford for Bloomberg News, and it's like that would not be very ethical. I said, "Well, let me see if I can point you in the right direction." So I called someone in the PR department at Ford headquarters.
Mhm.
I was on good terms with, And I explained what was going on, like who should I tell him to contact. He gave me the name of someone at Ford's European PR division, and so I passed it on, and I washed my hands of it, from then on. But the foundation did eventually get the car. As it turned out, Ford still owns the car. The deal was
Hmm.
it's essentially a long-term loan, but Ford wanted to retain ownership because if something happened to that foundation, then they wanted to be sure they get it back and
Yeah.
not have it go out into the general driving population. But the funny thing is, over the years, I've occasionally heard flack about it. People don't like it, or at least the people that I interact with don't like it. They think that's like a overt advertisement for Ford. That minute of screen time. Um,
Do you feel like it was an advertisement, or do you think it was like a joke?
I don't think it was a joke. You know what? I always thought maybe it's just Bond's rental car. He
Well,
arrived
yeah, yeah.
because there are other instances like this where Bond's driving an ordinary car. In Thunderball, Connery drives a Lincoln Continental. That was like a rich man's car, but it's not dashing and thing. It's
It's
on
not a
screen for about a
DB5.
minute.
Yeah.
He drives up to Largo's place for lunch, and then in A View to a Kill, Roger Moore's driving some kind of Ford product while he's following Stacy Sutton. Um, but
I remember it got chuckles at one of the screenings I saw when the movie was first in cinemas. And I think it was just because that's not the kind of car you would associate with Bond. It's not a luxury supercar. There's nothing fantastical about it. And because like it probably is, in the story, just this is the rental car he got, when he arrived in Nassau, that it would make sense that he's not. And this is all the movie's all about Bond becoming the James Bond we know. And so he doesn't have the Aston Martin yet. He doesn't have all the refinery that we come to associate the character with. So I think some people just kind of thought it was funny in my screenings that, he's driving this Ford rental car. Um, but I mean, it makes sense. And, because people nowadays will say, well, why is this secret agent driving around in all these flashy cars? But I was trying to do some research about it because the two commentaries that are on the Blu-ray don't mention the vehicle at all. um, and I found on Wikipedia of all places, it said the Mondeo nameplate is derived from the Latin word mundus, meaning world. And in Casino Royale, you know the Mondeo is not enough, and he does get his Aston Martin. So
well, it's also funny. Ford got into some trouble. It was viewed as cheapening the Jaguar brand when they owned it because they came out with this thing they called the X Type. And it
mm,
was essentially a glorified Mondeo with some extras. This was in the early 2000s.
okay,
And they got a lot of criticism for the X Type. And eventually the X Type did go away. Um, for that reason. Anyway, it's just interesting. Now you could cite, well, what about the Citroen, if that's the right pronunciation, and For Your Eyes Only? But in my mind, that first of all, it advanced the storyline. Bond has lost his supercar because it exploded, and now he's got to like get by with this thing. And it demonstrates that Bond doesn't need a supercar to outdrive villains. And
especially for Roger Moore.
yeah. And so I thought that in advanced story also he gets to know the leading lady better, through this stressful
Yeah,
experience. And by the time the chase is over, they seem to be on pretty good terms. She helps him a couple times during the drive with shifting the car and stuff like that. So I think I to me, the Mondeo is just kind of there, and
yeah.
it could be anything. It just happens to be a Mondeo.
I mean, if I had the choice between the two, I would pick the Mondeo, but maybe not. Maybe not in fiberglass, but I'd rather
Yeah,
have that than the yellow Citroen. And also, in trying to like find out more about it, like there's different regions that it's in, and it has different names. Um, it was also called the Contour in North America from '94 to 2000,
mm,
and
that's right. I remember
also
those.
that it got rebranded as the Taurus in the Middle East from 2022 to today, which I was like, okay, because that's not exactly what I think of when I think of a Ford Taurus, but apparently, if you go to the Middle East, it's called that.
Interesting. I didn't know that. Anyway, it's interesting. I talked about it with Peter Brooker. He has a
Yeah,
podcast. That would be Bond. Or sorry if
there
I'm
will be
misquoting the
Bond.
title.
I think it was still from Taylor's with Love when you did that episode, right? Before he
Yeah,
went through his rebrand.
yeah.
Yeah, that
And
was
then
a
he
good
changed
episode.
it. And then he started to say, well, it divides the fandom. Then he caught himself and said, well, actually, it might unite the fandom because a lot of people don't like it. Um, and again, it's only on screen for a minute. The fact it generated that much of a reaction was just odd to me. I mean, again, to me, it's just there. And, um, but anyway, it's in the custody of the Ian Fleming Foundation while still being the property of the Ford Motor Company.
Do they show it off anywhere? Do you know, or is it in like Bond in Motion or any of those other exhibits that have cropped up over the last couple of years?
It may be, but I don't know. I've kind of lost contact with those guys, and so I don't really know. It might be in. There's that show in Chicago at
Yeah,
the museum. It might be there. I thought I caught a glimpse of it. There was a recent story on CBS Sunday Morning. They showed some of those vehicles, and I thought I caught a glimpse of the Mondeo, but I'm not quite sure. Um, Again, it's for a car that's in the movie for so little time. It does generate a rise out of some people. I mean, the folks at the screening you attended of Casino Royale. Um, I don't know. It's funny, but I just wanted to bring it up for the podcast simply because I knew something about it, and and again, you know what? I also strongly suspect it probably can't go that fast because I doubt they put a regular engine in it.
yeah,
Um, because here's another famous prototype car that you will know about, and that is the Batmobile from the 1966 TV
I
show,
do indeed.
because it was originally a prototype. They called them show cars, and it's like, this isn't something we're going to build. We're just building it, putting it in auto shows just to show you what we could do if we really wanted to. And in its original form, actually appeared in a movie called It Started with a Kiss, starring Glenn Ford and Debbie Reynolds. And even though it's not been decked out like the Batmobile, it's instantly recognizable to anyone
Yeah,
who's ever seen the TV show. And what happened was, when the TV show was beginning production, they needed a Batmobile, and they somehow got their hands on it. Was called the Futura. They got their hands on the prototype. They handed it off to a guy named George Barris, who customized vehicles for TV shows and movies. And so he repainted it black and made it more Batmobile-ish. Um, but in real life, the car couldn't go faster than 40 miles an hour, at least so I've read. And and again, if you watch the show carefully, um, the Batmobile is usually off by itself. It was actually Mulholland Drive where they would filmed a lot of those scenes. It's like there's no traffic anywhere close to it, and where you see it in traffic is like on the studio backlot, exterior sets. Um,
it often looks like it's sped up, like the footage, the frames are sped up.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
And also going back to Casino Royale for a minute. So when you first see the Mondeo, there's this sounds like it's roaring along, but like I kind of wonder if that's just a sound effect that they added on to give the impression it's going faster than it probably was.
Yeah, from what I've found looking online, like the average Mondeo had around 150 horsepower. So not very quick.
Right. And also a footnote about George Barris. He has a James Bond connection too. He made that little Bathos submarine in Diamonds Are Forever, the one that Blofeld's trying to get away from
Oh yeah.
the oil rig on. So yeah, he made that for the production.
So you got to see the Mondeo in Paris?
I saw it in Paris, and then I saw it again sometime later, about 4 years later, at they call them work weekends, and it was in Momence, Illinois, south of Chicago, about 90 minutes south of Chicago, and that's where I tapped on the hood and like was checking it out, and I started to hear about what a delicate shape it was in. So
How did it look?
it looked okay.
It just seemed average.
Yeah, very average.
Yeah.
It's like that's the thing about the Mondeo. There's just nothing really very unique about it. It's a result of a product placement deal. At the time Casino Royale was made, Ford owned Land Rover, they owned Jaguar, and they owned Aston Martin. And vehicles from all three of those brands appear in the film. In fact, the thing in the scene in the parking lot, these annoying guys, pull up in their Land Rover and they mistake Bond for, the valet and toss him the keys. And then, so what he does, he hops into their Land Rover and then rams it into a Jaguar. And so Ford was covered in all those vehicles,
The whole thing.
in that sequence. So
I mean, if you're going to try and actually be a covert secret agent, a nondescript silver car seems like a good way to go to blend in with the crowd, because the vehicle is very unremarkable from a design standpoint, which is kind of like a lot of modern cars these days.
yeah, and like the other examples I cited, that Lincoln Continental that Connery drove very briefly in Thunderball, and it's a Lincoln Continental. And I don't even know the model that off the top of my head that Roger Moore drove in A View to a Kill. But again, it's like something, he's trying to blend in. So it makes sense.
Yeah.
There's just something about the Mondeo that gets a little more criticism than those other examples. But anyway, so we're coming to the end of our time. Javier, is there anything you'd like to add?
I think we pretty much covered all those bases. Happy that we're moving forward with our podcast. And of course, you can find me reviewing the 007 comics on David Lee's website, the JamesBondDossier.com. And hopefully, I think we have a new series starting up at the end of this month. So that'll be exciting to get another fresh voice. Because who knows when we're going to see another movie or when the next video game is coming out. There still hasn't been any news on that project. I think it's Project IO. I think that's the company, the studio. So
yeah,
continue to wait on
and you can see my work at the Spy Command, which is at hmssweblog.wordpress.com. I think we'll call it a day.
Sounds good to
Javier, thanks for coming along, and we'll all see you on the next episode of the 007 Files. Take care.